where you at. So I hope that it doesn't interfere with my talk too much, because it's hard to hear myself twice. So let's see if I can you put my slides on the screen as well, please? Yeah, awesome. So I hope that everyone can see it. Let me go to full screen and we can start. Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining this great conference, and I'm happy to be here. And my session will be about open source, and open source is open choice, right? So in this talk, I will give you a set of tools to help ease your decision about open source adoption, when you should do it, and practical tools that you can use to choose the right open source project for you. So first of all, hi, my name is Hila Fish. I'm a senior DevOps engineer and I work for Wix. I have 15 years of experience in the tech industry. I have recently joined the AWS Community Builders Program, which helps me know a lot about AWS, but also communicate with a lot of like-minded people. I help co-organize conferences in Israel, where I live, DevOps Days Tel Aviv and Statscraft. I'm a mentor in courses and communities, both I co-manage a community in Facebook with physical meetups and all for open source. And also I help lead some programs in a community for technical women in tech. So I really enjoy contributing back to the great communities that we have out there. I'm a DevOps culture fan. I think this is what helps companies achieve great things and achieve success. And I'm a lead singer in a cover band, as you can see in this picture, and it is a lot of fun. Okay, so open source software is publicly available and can be modified at will. Of course, you don't just merge to main, you open a PR, right? And the thing is that a lot of tools that we use in our day-to-day is open source. So React, Java, Firefox, and Linux, right? So a lot of tools that we use for a lot of time is open source, and it is awesome to know. So in the late 90s, proprietary software was considered the standard, and the notion of making source code public was considered bad strategy for tech companies. And coming forward to 2020 and up until now, the concept of open source became mainstream. So what's so good about open source? Because there are a lot of things to say about it. So let's see, what does it help us? So open source helps build a rich developer community. It's basically a society that is based on knowledge, but really relies on the core values of communication and collaboration to succeed. And Manish Sharma, who's the general manager of GitHub India, he said that open source is an enabler of innovation, and that companies that either that turn to open source either open their code base to be public or contribute projects to open source, it helps speed up their business transformation. So open source boosts our code quality and security because, as Linus Torvalds said, the creator of Linux and Git, he said that given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. So since code is publicly available, then anyone can spot and correct errors or omissions. So of course, you don't only spot the issues. If you fix them, then the code will be in a higher quality state and much more secured. Also, open source boosts adaptivity, because what is adaptivity? If we have more users, then we have more use cases, and then the code will be more robust. And it is adaptive to various use cases, and it allows to surface bugs and edge cases much more rapidly than traditional QA processes. And it also encourages more modularity and avoiding this one-size-fits-all kind of assumption, resulting in greater flexibility and lower customization costs in the long run. Agility. So a lot of open source projects follow modern software development processes, which leads to rapid development cycles, which leads to more frequent releases without sacrificing quality. Also in open source, we have less bureaucracy, right? Because opening a PR versus opening a commercial support ticket, it's two different things. And in open source, we don't have regularly scheduled release processes like we have for proprietary companies that sometimes needs to release only on Sundays. On open source, you just release the version and anyone can use it whenever they want. So I want to talk to you about the DevOps perspective towards open source, because usually it's something that is more discussed from the developer's perspective. And I want to show you how we DevOps, at least from my take and other people that I talked with, how we perceive open source. So first of all, in order to understand our perspective, we need to understand the developer's perspective. So developers say, we have functionality factors to consider. So will the library that I just found get integrated in my code properly? And what efforts are needed to do so? Maybe I need to do refactoring. As opposed to that, DevOps, we care about the environment, and the environment is our main focus. So we think about the project that we found, the open source project, and we need to really think if the project will be well integrated in our environment. And also, we have other considerations like security and maintenance to think about as well. Another thing is that collaboration is a common ground between DevOps and open source. And as you can see here, collaboration leads to better conclusions and solutions. And why? Because when communities form around shared challenges, then the diversity of ideas that naturally emerges surfaces better solutions. And a lot of things that I mentioned here, there was a link that I will share later on from a great article I found about from Ben Balter, and he really talks about the open source adoption in a good way. So I think, and I really urge you to read this because it will give you a much more perspective, more than the amount of time that I deliver here. Another thing about open source is that we treat open source as tools, and we ask ourselves, do we want to introduce this to our system because it will help us deliver this code or automate this or introduce this capability? So since a lot of DevOps engineers came from the background as system engineers like me, then the integration concept is no strange to us. So we can just take a tool, integrate it with our in our environment, like we treat it as just a tool chain, and that's basically it. But of course, not everything is good. We always need to think about other complexity that is introduced when we think about open source. And we are in a constant state of trade-offs and maintaining balance, because we want to do upgrades, right? Because there are features, there are bug fixes, but we don't want to rock the boat too much. And maybe the feature that the version has is not really worthwhile, and I should wait and not do too many maintenance to not rock the boat too much. Also, complexity. So show me one person that is able to upgrade Jenkins or its plugins without having any fear that it will get break, right? So there are complexities, there are dependencies that we need to think about in order not to cause any downtimes. And in the middle of everything, we have research, because once we find a project that we want to integrate in our environment, we need to read about it, read reviews, read if there are actual use cases in production. And we want to make sure that we know what we introduce to our environment. Another thing, this is generally speaking true for DevOps, but also for open source. We need to keep tabs and be informed of what's going on. And I will give you an example. I found a project, an open source project, version 1.0 is not that suitable for my use case. The features is not exactly what I need, and maybe there's also a bug that needs to be fixed, and I can't really afford introducing this bug to my environment. So I should keep tabs and keep watch on that project, and maybe version 2.0 will be much more suitable for my use case, and maybe that bug was fixed, and then it will be much more what I need, right? So this is one example. Another example is the example of CentOS. The operating system, CentOS, reached end of life at the end of 2021. And in case you don't know, end of life means there are no more security patches that are being released to that operating system, which means that if I have systems that have CentOS installed, then I'm putting my systems at risk, because they are much more vulnerable now for hacks and all sort of things. So if I didn't know about that, then I'm putting my systems at risk instead of doing whatever necessary, either migrate to another operating system to make sure that my systems are healthy and stable. And I really like this picture because it says keep moving people, even though, as you can see, nobody is there. That's the thing. You need to keep tabs and be informed of what's going on without having your team leader breathing down your neck and saying, hey, please check this and that. You need to do it by yourself and to be proactive. And I think this is what will help you be a better engineer as well. Okay, so let's talk now about when should we consider open source, because maybe it's not always the best option for you, depends on where you are at the moment in project-wise and stuff like that. So let's consider when to adopt open source software. So first of all, uncommon use case, and I can tell you an example that I had in one of my previous companies. We used a Google Cloud Platform and specifically GKE, the Google Kubernetes engine, for running applications on Kubernetes. And we had application that didn't need to run all the time. So only based on several conditions, it need to run. In other times, just it could be down and all would be good. And at that time, and I think it's still now, downscaling pods to 0 wasn't possible on GKE. So we searched for a solution for that, and we found Keda. Keda is an awesome open source tool that helps you downscale pods to 0 based on certain conditions, and the project is very well maintained. It is declared as production ready, and it's basically good use, especially in production, because it's very well maintained. So this is one example of using an open source tool when you have an uncommon use case that proprietary software doesn't help you, or your cloud provider doesn't provide something, and you don't always have to go to these directions, because if you have an open source tool that helps with your needs, then you might as well use it, and I will mention it again very soon. Another reason to adopt open source when you have limited budget. So when your budget is limited and you can't really afford purchasing an enterprise license of the software, then you can use its free version or on an open source alternative. And it will also allow lower total cost of ownership, because adopting open source software generally has lower cost because the software itself often comes at no cost or relatively low cost, and shifts the cost center from licensing to customization and implementation. And also think about it this way: training, maintenance, and support will be equally invested in an open source project adoption versus proprietary software. So again, might as well boost open source adoption if there is no significant reason that prevents you from doing so. Another reason to adopt open source is when you have insufficient in-house resources, ability-wise, like this family guy right here, or capacity-wise to create a solution of your own or to enhance a solution. And also, there's a saying, why reinvent the wheel, right? So if there is also already an open source project that fits your needs, just adopt it, and that's basically it. We can't talk about anything in life really only on the good side. We need to cover the bad as well, the bad or the problematic or the complex, right? So let's cover some disadvantages of open source that I think that is worthwhile to mention. So first of all, security by obscurity. This notion doesn't apply on open source, because proprietary software companies can claim that their code is much more secure than open source because of that, because the source code is closed, then hackers can't really exploit loopholes since the code is not available, it's not public. So this is one thing to consider. Other than that, sorry, my mouse, I don't know. Other than that, the open source is sometimes prone to abuse. Let's take, for example, the colors NPM package, where the maintainer added a loop in the code and caused a lot of trouble for a lot of companies. And Faker.js, where, if I'm not mistaken, the maintainer had a bankruptcy, and then the version that he released was actually no version. He deleted the project. So you can say, hey, I can just, for libraries, right? I can just lock the version in requirements.txt for Python, or packages JSON lock, and be done with it. But a lot of companies don't do that, and otherwise we wouldn't hear about these two examples in a global scale, right? So it's something to consider. I can say that it really happens a lot, because people usually are good and they want to contribute good things, but it could happen, and it's something to consider once we decide to adopt open source. Compliance. So in its raw form, open source usually gives no warranty or official guarantee, making it difficult to use in a business environment where compliance is a must. As we all know, open source is not always entirely free. We need to check the fine print and see the licensing and what it is about, and especially if the reason for you to select open source is because of budgeting reasons, then you need to check if the open source software is indeed free or not. Discontinued projects. So a lot of the times, the projects are not backed up by companies, but by people like me and you, and they could decide that they discontinue to support these projects because they don't have the money, they don't have the time to do it, and that's okay. So it means that if that happens and you adopted a discontinued project, it means that you either need to migrate to another solution, or you will be the one to start supporting this project from now on. Support is not always guaranteed, right? You need to assume good faith because they don't owe you anything, especially if the project is backed up by people like me and you and not companies. But I mentioned Keda before, I will mention it again. Once we introduced it, and it was like a second before being full-blown production, I had some issues that introduced only with volume of data, and I opened an issue about it in GitHub. I explained the situation, I explained it's about to be production any day now, and I think it was on a Thursday evening or Friday, like outside of work hours. The maintainers really helped, and they released a new version, and it was awesome. So I assume good faith when I work with open source, and I hope that you would too. And another thing is that proprietary software does have support guaranteed, but it doesn't mean that the support will be good. So that's also something to think about. And last but not least, SaaS alternatives. So it's not really the opposite of an open source, but on some occasions, companies will prefer the SaaS managed solution because it saves them time to manage the software, to integrate it, and dev enablement shifts from DevOps dependency to a cloud lock scenario that in the overall trade-off is worthwhile. And SaaS popularity is likely only to rise as organizations shift more and more resources to the cloud. Okay, so to sum things up in regards to adopting open source software, really there is no right or wrong when it comes to that. It's a matter of perspective, and there are multiple factors to consider and you need to choose the best solution for your needs. And speaking of your needs, how do we choose an open source project? Because let's say you Googled your use case, you found 2, 3, 4 open source tools that cover your use case. How do you select the one for you, the one that fits exactly for what you need? So let's cover some questions that you need to ask and answer in order to understand how to choose the right open source projects for you. So we will cover popularity, activity, security, readiness, documentation, ecosystem, ease of use, and roadmap. So let's cover each one. So first of all, popularity. Check how many GitHub stars a project has. Always bear that in mind because especially when open source software is backed up by a company, then maybe they have like a marketing department that helps promote the project, whether it's good or not, right? So just make sure that you take into consideration GitHub stars in together with other components as well, and not only that, because it's not always like the best thing, but it usually, like a rule of thumb, it does mean that if a project has a lot of GitHub stars, it is very popular and very used. Another thing is that you need to check if the project is part of CNCF or incubator, because if so, it means the project follows a high quality standard, which is good because it means that it will be much more mature and will be maybe much more popular because it follows these standards. You should Google the project alone to check for online presence, but you should also Google the project versus similar products to check for reviews, because we want to make sure that we know what we introduced to our environment and that maybe other people thought about things and documented it in a way that help us detect if it's something that is suitable for our use case or not. Activity. So let's check the commit rate and to see if they are daily, weekly, monthly. And also we need to check how many issues are there, how many releases are there. Is the project maintained by one developer or more? Does the project has sponsors or backed up by a company? So all of these questions is meant for you to understand that if you will adopt a certain open source software, and then you will need a bug fix or you will wait for a feature, how long approximately you will have to wait in order to get those. So if you have a heavy use case where you will probably need frequent releases or frequent maintenance of that open source software, then activity is a very important metric to think about because of that reason. Security. So I think, or at least in my experience, it's more suitable for or more thought of from the developers angle, because supply chain is a thing in code, right? Because they need to integrate that library in their code, as opposed to DevOps where we have a project and we just integrate in our environment. So there is no really a supply chain, but at least for my experience, maybe you guys experience something else, but security should always be a factor to consider in whatever you do at work or in life. So check known vulnerabilities and any supply chain considerations that might need to be revised or might need to be reviewed. And I also put a link here for tools to check security risk open source dependencies that might help you in this regard. We will share it afterwards. Readiness. So is the project declared as production ready, like KEDA that I mentioned is production ready. A lot of users use it in production, which is good for me to know because, hey, I'm the owner of production. I'm the production gatekeeper, as you can say. So I want to make sure it is matured enough and really in a ready enough state to use in production. And also we need to check if the current features are enough to sustain usage. And also, is my use case covered fully in the current state? And if not, am I okay with it? Because if I'm not okay with it, maybe I need to keep tabs and check back this project, and maybe the next version will be much more up my alley. So that's about that. Documentation. So documentation is basically, if you think about it, it's like the gateway for that project, right? Because you don't know anything about this project and you want to know how to integrate this project in your environment, how, if there are known issues, if the features are very well explained for you to understand if it fits your use case or not, right? So if documentation is rich and cover most aspects that I mentioned, then it will be very easy not only to integrate, but also to maintain in your day-to-day and to take the decision whether to incorporate it in your environment or not. Because if the features are not explained, then maybe you don't know if this project is good for your use case or not. So as much as the documentation will be much more richer, then it will help you take this decision whether to incorporate this software or not. Ecosystem. So I think that this is the most important metric here. I think that all of them are important, but this metric will be the one that you will mostly feel in your day-to-day, and I will explain. In one of my previous jobs, I used Rundeck as the CI tool, and at that time, documentation wasn't great, and the ecosystem was very small. So once I needed to change some flows or enhance other flows or introduce new capabilities, it was very hard for me to do because documentation wasn't great and I didn't have anyone to reach out to. There wasn't any Slack or Telegram or Discord workspace that helped with people that are engaged. Also on their GitHub, they weren't engaged, so it was very hard to speak with people that already have experience with Rundeck that could help and suggest for me what to do. As opposed to that, in other company, I use Jenkins for the CI tool. You can say a lot of things about Jenkins, but the Jenkins has a very large ecosystem. So Also, documentation is pretty good. So once I had issues with Jenkins, or not even issues, like deliberations, how to do things in a certain way, I reached out to the community, either through the GitHub repository or through community channels like Slack. If I'm not mistaken, they also have like their own workspace in Slack, but if not, then there are a lot of Jenkins channels in a lot of tech community Slack workspaces. So I reached out, and a lot of people just helped me, and it was awesome because I learned from others' experience and from their line of thought. And it's not only that, it's not only the fact that you need to reach out to, or you could reach out to the community. It's the fact that if the ecosystem is large, it means that there are more use cases, more users that use this tool, and then it means that whatever or could be whatever stuff that you would want to introduce to your tool features or tools capabilities or use cases, it will probably be it, because a lot of users are using it, so probably it fits a lot of use cases. So ecosystem is very, very important, and really try to select tools that have a very large ecosystem, because it will help in your day-to-day. Ease of use, so do a POC, see how well it gets integrated in your environment, and see the ratio between the amount of time to implement until the integration is finally done. And also check the issues on GitHub. Are the issues about features or about how do I do X? Because if the issues are about how do I do X, maybe the project is not that easy to use, and it is something to consider, especially if you have heavy use case. And last but not least, roadmap. Is the project defined as an open source project, or planned to go towards monetization, which means that the code will be not open source, but closed source? And also check for features planning. If there is a roadmap and the maintainers already know what features they are planning and will be released in future versions, then it means the project is very well thought of, and you know that whatever you will need, probably it will be in a very organized procedure and basically well maintained. So to sum things up in regards to choosing an open source project, ask the general questions to cover the basics and understand if the project is in a ready enough state, but also ask the tailored specific questions to cover your use case and your pain points. So for example, if you have heavy use case, as I mentioned before, focus on documentation and ecosystem metrics. I would say also activity, because these metrics will be the ones that will help in your day-to-day. And if you have no capacity for maintenance, for example, then you should focus and really put more weight on the readiness and the ease of use metrics. Do a POC, see how well it gets integrated in your environment, and rely on your research. Ecosystem to the rescue, and engage in GitHub, raise issues, and basically contribute to the project success and eventually your success. And I want to finish up with one token from me, because I really love open source, and I think that it's very important. How to contribute to open source without writing a single line of code, because you don't have the time to do it, or because you don't know how to do it, because not all of us are developers or are very good with code, but regardless, we can still contribute to open source. So how can we do that? So first of all, open issues, bug fixes, or feature requests. It will help the project be much more robust and fit a lot of use cases because of what you will raise. Modified documentation. So as I showed you, documentation is part of the considerations, and it is a metric of its own. And writing documentation is a skill. And the speaker before me said that maybe a lot of people don't like to write documentation, but documentation is key. And if you don't, if the documentation is not good enough, maybe I wouldn't even select this project because I don't know what this project is about, right? So if you have this skill, please leverage it to make the documentation much more clear, more concise, and much more thorough. It will help me, it will help others, and believe me, everyone will thank you for that. Another thing is to share your use case. You can write a blog post. I've written a blog post about Scriptsterver, which is an open source tool that helps you expose Ansible playbooks, Terraform, and other scripts as a UI with a permissions mechanism. it was good and awesome for our use case back then. And I wrote a blog post about it because maybe other will read it and say, hey, it fits my use case as well, let's adopt that. So if you have adopted open source tools, you can write blog posts about it as well and help other people by doing that. Share tools that you found with colleagues and techie friends. Just yesterday, I found out about an open source tool, an open source project that was released by AWS Labs to help developer productivity. So I posted about it in my LinkedIn, and it's good because now people could maybe use it and it will help them in their day-to-day. Sponsorship. So either if you are able to contribute and some money, it will be awesome, especially for projects that are maintained by individuals and not company backed up. And maybe you can convince your company to sponsor these projects as well. It could actually be the thing that will help that project to succeed and to be active. So if you can do that, it will be awesome. Hold an open source mindset. So aim to incorporate open source projects wherever possible and reasonable, aka don't just go immediately to proprietary software, but check for open source solutions that help with your use cases. And if you do that, maybe you can inspire others to do that as well, because they will see you doing it and maybe they will adopt it as well. And last but not least, spread word on open source at conferences like I'm doing just now. So, and I think I have a little bit more time, since I really like open source. One of the things that we have in our open source community in Facebook called pull request is this initiative called Open Source Rel, like DevRel, but for open source, which basically showcase how companies perceive open source and contribute actively to that realm. So for example, Wix, the company that I work for, have contribution days each quarter. Like you can, for entire week in a quarter, you can sit and contribute to open source while you're at work, which is awesome. So we just showcase how companies contribute to open source and perceive it because of two reasons. One, we hope that other companies will see it as well and will probably or will want to do some more things and progress more towards the open source realm as well. And the other reason is because individuals like me, like any other people that like or love open source and share these values of collaboration and communication, they want to go work for companies that have the same values. So if, for example, I know about Wix that allows me to contribute to open source during my work time, then it will be awesome. And maybe I would like to go and work for these companies as well. So this initiative is rather new. We have only a few companies here, but we are actively adding more and more companies. And if you guys want to have your company featured in this initiative as well, just reach out through these contact details that I have here, email, LinkedIn or Twitter, and it will be awesome to feature you. And you can also, of course, reach out if you have any questions about open source or about SRE or DevOps topics. I'm not a full-blown open source contributor, but so